In August 2019, a tweet from President Donald Trump stunned the world. He canceled an official visit to Denmark, one of America's closest NATO allies, simply because Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen refused to discuss buying Greenland. The international media exploded with ridicule. It was called the craziest idea of the 21st century, the joke of an impulsive president with a flair for stirring public opinion through outrageous statements. But amid the laughter, few stopped to ask, why would a US president, a businessman who had spent his life immersed in numbers and deals, be so interested in a frozen island more than 4,000 kilometers away from Washington? Time passed. The event slowly faded from public memory, becoming just another odd detail in Donald Trump's first term. But to him, it was never a joke. 6 years later, after winning re-election at the end of 2024, Trump returned to the White House not just with a mission to restore America's global standing, but to complete the unfinished plans he once set aside. This time, however, he no longer spoke of buying Greenland. No more real estate lingo. Instead, he talked about control, about strategic defense, about critical resources for America's survival in a world entering its most cutthroat era since the Cold War. Suddenly, Greenland was no longer a blank, anonymous patch on the world map. It had become the focal point of a quiet but tense geopolitical race. And while Donald Trump still believed that with the might of a superpower, America could reshape the world to its will, he had no idea that on that very same chessboard, a neighboring country was quietly gaining the upper hand. Not through threats, but with a quiet, formidable presence, Canada. And so, the Greenland dream was reignited by Trump, this time not amid laughter, but under the rising tide of a silent storm. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, America was no longer the same country it had been 6 years earlier. The world had changed, too. The new Cold War was no longer about nuclear threats or arms races. It was about the scramble for every inch of strategic land, every deposit of rare minerals, and every critical link in the global supply chain. In that context, Trump's Greenland dream no longer seemed bizarre. It had become a key move in a high-stakes game he believed he had to play before someone else beat him to it. In his very first State of the Union address after taking office, Trump declared that Greenland is a land of vital importance to U.S. national security. No more dancing around the issue, no more ambiguity. He stated outright that America needed a stronger presence in the Arctic, which he described as a power vacuum that Russia and China would not hesitate to fill. To support his case, Trump pointed to the U.S. military's Thule Air Base in Greenland, built during the Cold War and still operational today. He emphasized, "We've been there before, and now it's time to do more." This time, there was no talk of purchasing like back in 2019. Trump had shifted to a far more assertive language: control, protection, leadership. He proclaimed that America had a responsibility to defend the free world, and that included making sure Greenland didn't fall into hostile hands. Behind those public declarations, lobbying groups began pushing Congress to relax regulations so American corporations could access Greenland's mineral wealth. Some lawmakers even proposed creating a joint extraction zone between the US and Denmark, an unprecedented idea. At the Pentagon, generals quietly revisited Eisenhower-era plans, from expanding the Thule base to updating air defense maps across the Arctic. One former senior official revealed that within the administration, Greenland was referred to by a short but haunting name: the Cold Key. To Trump, Greenland wasn't just a frozen landmass. It was the key to ensuring America stepped into the 21st century as a true superpower, militarily, technologically, and economically. But precisely because of that urgency, because of Trump's want it, get it attitude, the Greenland dream began to face fierce backlash. People weren't opposed because he was wrong. They were opposed because of how he went about it. Too blunt, too rushed, and completely lacking in consensus. Both Denmark and the people of Greenland felt dismissed. To them, Trump treating Greenland like a strategic asset to be controlled was no different from denying their very existence as an independent people. And so, as debates raged in Washington over sovereignty, defense strategy, and superpower ambition, a quieter but sharper question began to emerge. Why exactly has Greenland become the prize in a global tug-of-war? What lies beneath those ancient layers of ice, that could drive a US president to pursue it across 2 terms. And what gives a small nation like Greenland the courage to flat out reject the overtures of a superpower? The answer isn't on the surface. It lies far deeper. Beneath the stark white expanse are geological treasures the modern world cannot live without. Veins of technological power and strategic links capable of shifting the balance of global power. Greenland, as the world is beginning to realize, isn't just land. It is the future. Greenland's surface may be icy, but beneath that frozen layer lies something the world's great powers can't take their eyes off. It's not just about defense strategy or the island's position blocking the Arctic radar line. Greenland is a land rich in what many now call the gold of the digital age. Rare earth elements. These seemingly obscure minerals are, in fact, the beating heart of all modern technology, from smartphones and electric vehicles to energy storage, guided weapon systems, satellites, and military radar networks. In a world powered by tech, rare earths are indispensable. And Greenland, with reserves ranked among the largest on Earth, has become the center of a quiet but fierce race. Alongside rare earths are molybdenum, graphite, and zirconium, crucial materials for producing ultra-durable, heat-resistant components used in jet engines and nuclear reactors. Geological reports released since 2022 suggest Greenland could hold over 17 billion barrels of crude oil and trillions of cubic feet of untapped natural gas, a treasure trove of energy in a post-energy crisis world starving for fuel. Every vein of rock beneath the ice could shape the economic and technological balance for decades to come. With those numbers, it's no wonder Donald Trump put Greenland at the forefront of his plan to rebuild America. He believed that if the US didn't act fast, China or Russia would step in first. And if that happened, Washington would lose control over both technology and security. Some members of Congress agreed. They argued that if America had helped protect Greenland through NATO for decades, then it had every reason to claim a stake when it came time to reap the benefits. But the problem lay in the approach. While Canada chose cooperation, investment, and consensus, Trump brought with him the image of a superpower seeking to annex by security logic. It wasn't just a tactical misstep. It was an insult to the pride of a people. The Greenlanders, though living in one of the world's harshest climates with a population of just over 50,000, never saw themselves as a commodity to be bargained over. And as America's intentions became clearer, Greenland's stance began to shift from quiet observation to direct resistance. Denmark, Greenland's official patron state, could no longer ignore Washington's growing push for control. And from Nuuk, Greenland's capital, to Copenhagen, Denmark's powerful voices rose, not out of fear of losing territory, but out of the awareness that if they didn't speak now, there might be nothing left to defend later. And so, for the first time in decades, a sharp and emotional rebuttal was issued. Not from a traditional seat of power, but from a place once dismissed as remote, frigid, and forgotten on the world map. As Washington's rhetoric grew more explicit, saying the US was ready to act in the name of security, that Greenland should be protected and benefit from American leadership, Denmark could no longer remain silent. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen stepped up to the podium in Copenhagen, her face marked with an uncharacteristic sternness. She didn't avoid the issue. She didn't mince words. She spoke a single resounding sentence that echoed across Europe. Greenland belongs to the Greenlandic people. It wasn't just a political statement. It was a declaration of dignity, of sovereignty, and of the unyielding line that no democratic nation should allow another to cross. Immediately afterward, the Danish parliament convened an emergency session, issuing a joint statement with Greenland's autonomous government, rejecting any form of coercion or external interference. One elderly member of parliament told reporters, "We may be small, but we are not pawns on anyone's chessboard." The words were gentle, but their weight was undeniable, especially because they came from an ally, not a rival, of the United States. In Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, the atmosphere was just as charged. Prime Minister Mutta Burupagede appeared on national television dressed in a traditional deep blue tunic, his voice slow but unwavering. "We are not a territory to be priced. We are a people with the right to determine our own future." That sentence was widely quoted across European media, not for any fiery language, but for its quiet strength and profound self-respect. Suddenly, the Arctic chill seemed to burn. The people of Greenland, long accustomed to isolated living, fishing, reindeer hunting, and preserving their indigenous culture, now faced a monumental choice: to become a link in the global geopolitical chain, or to assert their right to self-determination and continue their own path of development. Slower, perhaps, but independent. And they chose. They didn't need to be led. They needed to be respected. The powerful response from Greenland and Denmark forced many European nations to reconsider their relationships with the US. When the sovereignty of a long-standing ally could be threatened by its closest partner, how secure could anyone else in NATO feel? A hairline fracture had formed, at first just a thin crack on the ice, but it steadily widened. And from within the heart of the world's largest military alliance, the faint sound of discord began to echo, quiet yet strong enough to make the world stop and listen. NATO, a military alliance once built on a foundation of trust and mutual commitment, is now beginning to shake from within. When a founding member like the United States publicly threatens the sovereignty of another ally, Denmark, the cracks that once seemed invisible now stand exposed under the cold light of realpolitik. The issue is no longer just about Greenland. It raises a deeper question. Within an alliance, does respect still matter if power starts being used as a tool of coercion? Norway was the first to speak out. In a carefully worded statement, Oslo declared that any form of pressure on Greenland is also a threat to the integrity of the Nordic region. This wasn't just a gesture of solidarity, it was a warning to Washington. The Arctic is not no man's land, and any presence here must be based on cooperation, not domination. Canada, though saying little, made its displeasure clear through principled remarks. A senior official in Ottawa said softly but firmly, "Using economic power to impose will on Indigenous communities is something we cannot support from anyone." In Canada's typically diplomatic tone, it was a clear and graceful rejection directed at the White House. France chose a different approach, dispatching a nuclear submarine to patrol waters near Greenland, a move without precedent in peacetime, meant to assert strategic presence. At the same time, Paris announced a development aid package worth hundreds of millions of euros, specifically for Greenland's aviation and infrastructure sectors, a silent yet weighty message that Europe would not stand idly by. Meanwhile, Poland, a nation currently receiving extensive military aid from the US, remained silent. But that silence raised questions. Has NATO ceased to be a unified bloc and instead become fragmented by diverging national interests? When a major power starts to act unilaterally, smaller members are forced to choose, speak out and risk retaliation, or stay quiet and lose strategic trust. Something has shifted. The unity once seen as NATO's cornerstone is now faltering under the weight of national ambition. No one dares say it out loud, but more and more are starting to whisper, if the alliance is no longer a place where nations feel protected, can it still be called an alliance? And while Europe debates, while the US presses on with its agenda, to the north, from a quiet, reserved land, Canada begins playing its own hand. No fanfare, no provocation, no talk of ownership, just deliberate, steady, strategic moves. While the superpowers wrestle for control, Canada has chosen to listen. And that, more than anything, is what may carry them farther than all the rest. While the world fixated on fiery rhetoric from Washington, angry reactions from Copenhagen, and emotional declarations from Nuuk, in a place that seemed to stand apart, Ottawa, a quiet but calculated strategy had already begun. No need to assert sovereignty, redraw maps, or proclaim leadership. Canada chose a different path, discreet, steady, and grounded in absolute respect for its partners. And that path, once again, proved that in modern geopolitics, it's not the loudest voice that wins, it's the wisest step. Since 2023, Canada had proactively engaged Greenland in areas that appeared apolitical: climate research, academic exchange, and technical support in resource management. These seemingly modest partnerships became the solid foundation for expanding influence, not through power, but through trust. By 2024, while the world still speculated whether Trump could buy Greenland, Canada had already signed agreements worth billions of dollars. One deal considered a turning point was the molybdenum mining partnership with Greenland Resources Inc., FIRS, a Canadian company experienced in operating in harsh Arctic climates. The project not only created jobs for Greenlanders, but also allocated a share of profits to establish a future generations investment fund managed by Greenland itself, something no other major power had ever offered. That was followed by a series of joint ventures with Amarok Minerals at the Nunok gold mine, which included not just mining infrastructure, but also investments in local healthcare and technical training programs. Canada wasn't doing this alone. With strategic foresight, it invited investment funds from Norway, the UK, and even the US, turning the agreements from Canada versus the United States into a multilateral cooperation initiative. The contracts even included clauses granting Greenlandic indigenous communities the right to veto projects that could harm their ecosystem. A politically ethical move many experts hailed as a post-colonial development model. What mattered most was that Greenlanders agreed. They felt heard, respected, and, most importantly, empowered. Their autonomous government wasn't forced to choose between Denmark or the US, but instead was welcomed as an equal player in a fair game on their own soil. And for Canada, that was the ultimate victory: to influence without owning, to build trust without imposing. In a world increasingly shaken by populism and heavy-handed interventions, Canada's strategy stood out as a complete countermodel. They didn't label it strategic transformation or national assertiveness. They simply called it cooperation. And that humility became their greatest strength. As the world began to see Canada as the ideal Arctic partner, in Washington, a quiet frustration began to spread. Emergency meetings piled up at the Pentagon as officials realized, while America was still issuing ultimatums and preaching leadership, someone else had already taken a seat at the table, signed the deals, and been welcomed with open arms. And by the time Washington wanted back in, that seat was no longer empty. In Washington, as internal reports began to flood in, a quiet sense of panic crept through national security meetings. Not because a hostile nation had seized control of a strategic territory, but because a friend, a close ally, had moved a step ahead without the United States even realizing it. Canada hadn't occupied, hadn't claimed, and hadn't provoked. But through binding, long-term, and entirely legal agreements, Ottawa had become the most welcomed name in Greenland. And for a superpower like the US, that was a defeat without a single shot fired, but more painful than any military loss. The Pentagon was the first to grasp the consequences. American defense contractors, especially those supplying guidance systems, missiles, and radar, now faced the risk of supply chain disruption. Greenland had once been viewed as a potential strategic reserve of rare earths and critical metals essential to smart weapons. But now, most of those mining rights had been committed to Canada and European partners. There was no room left for the US, at least not in the medium term. In the electric vehicle industry, America's post-COVID pride, corporations like Tesla, Ford, and General Motors began recalculating production costs. Resources they had once hoped to import from Greenland at favorable prices, thanks to political ties, now had to be sourced elsewhere, more expensive, more volatile, and far less secure. The Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, which had banked heavily on friendly mineral sources from Greenland, now seemed like wishful thinking. On Capitol Hill, some Republican lawmakers criticized the Trump administration for being too hasty, too loud, and too lacking in soft strategy. A senator from Maine remarked, "We had a chance if we had chosen Canada's path: negotiation, cooperation, and shared values, instead of treating Greenland like a forced investment." As criticism grew louder, the Trump administration scrambled to regain momentum. Some pushed for reopening negotiations with Denmark and Greenland. Others called for ramping up the military presence at Thule Air Base to send a strong message. But the clearest truth was this: once trust is lost, no base, no radar, and certainly no power is enough to regain the influence once held. Through its quiet strategy, Canada had effectively sidelined Washington from a game it had started. And from that failure, the United States was forced to reflect, not just on how it had approached Greenland, but on how it was engaging with a world that is evolving by the day. Greenland didn't become the 51st state of the United States, nor did it spiral into the kind of territorial dispute many once feared. But precisely because of those seemingly quiet developments, the icy island in the middle of the Atlantic has stepped into the spotlight of global geopolitics, not as a forgotten land, but as the centerpiece of 21st century strategic calculus. Today, Greenland stands as a symbol of a new era, one in which the choices of a small community can ripple out to influence the policies of the world's most powerful nations. From a semi-autonomous territory with just over 50,000 residents, Greenland has forced the US, Europe, and NATO to rethink their approach. Gone are the days when power was measured solely in warships or military bases. Sometimes what redraws the map isn't weaponry, it's trust, respect, and the willingness to listen. And if there's one overarching lesson, it's Canada's story. A nation that made no noise, imposed nothing, yet went farther than anyone else, armed only with a soft, sustainable, human-centered strategy. Greenland chose its own path, not part of America, not manipulated by Europe. They chose conditional cooperation, independence within alliances, and a self-determined future. It wasn't anyone's victory, but a powerful reminder that in a rapidly changing world, wisdom speaks louder than might. If you found this story thought-provoking, drop a comment below. What do you think about Trump's ambition, Greenland's response, and Canada's quiet strategy? And if you want to keep exploring deeper perspectives on global geopolitics, don't forget to hit subscribe and follow the channel, because the world is shifting every day, and now more than ever, we need to understand it.